Future Sense is a podcast edited from the radio show of the same name, broadcast on Bay FM in Byron Bay, Australia at bayfm.org. Hosted by Nick Jeans and well-known international futurist Steve McDonald, Future Sense provides a fresh, deep analysis of global trends and emergent technologies. How can we identify the layers of growth, personally, socially, and globally? What are the signs missed, the truths being denied? Science, history, politics, psychology, ancient civilizations, alien contact, the new psychedelic revolution, cryptocurrency and other disruptive and distributed technologies, and much more. This is Future Sense.
You are tuned to Future Sense here with Nick Jeans and Steve McDonald. We're talking today largely about the coronavirus and various ways and how we can approach and look at this outbreak and what it brings up in the human condition. And one of the things that's very clear is that lots of people, are very afraid. And as often happens when these kind of extraordinary exogenous things occur, we get fearful. But let's have a deeper look at that.
Yeah, and, I just want to say before we go into this that China has been in a very, very difficult position, and it did react rather severely, and after it decided to react, it moved very, very quickly to slow down the spread of the virus and try and stop it, and did, I think, extremely well in that process, including building a rather large hospital very quickly in Wuhan.
It's extraordinary.
Which is pretty amazing.
Just the number of people is a big factor, isn't it, when you have that many people?
It is, yeah. It's really impossible for us to sit here in judgment of whether that was appropriate or overblown or what, but certainly on a global level, there seems to have been a strange sort of overemphasized focus on the spread of the virus. Which is not necessarily looking justified the way that things are playing out in other countries. And fear, of course, is a major driver really within the first tier of consciousness. So we're talking about the first 6 layers of value systems, which run from our basic sort of hunter-gatherer survival times in history right through to the present day, and the emerging 6th layer, which is very human-centered and very network-centered as well. And Ross Hill, who's a name that you've certainly heard on the show before. We have had Ross on as a guest quite a few times. Ross sent me something over the weekend about the global stock market, and it was a little graph which basically had a meter that ran between fear on one scale and greed on the other scale, and an indicator needle showing what was driving the stock markets this week, whether it was fear or greed or what kind of mixture of the two.
I would think they need to be 2 separate graphs, because they both be pretty extreme most of the time, I would think.
Yeah, that's right. I mean that's probably an oversimplification and a bit of an exaggeration, but certainly there's a lot of truth underlying that. Fear is a major driver for humans in general, and it's only when we make this momentous leap across into the second tier of consciousness beyond layer 6 into layer 7 and past that we really let go of fear as a major driver in our lives. So for most people, most times, in most places, some at least of their behaviour is being fear driven. And when we're driven by fear, as we've discussed on the show previously, our responses are usually quite hasty, often unbalanced and disproportionate to whatever the perceived threat is. And the fear can be really useful, of course, when we do need to respond very, very quickly and instinctively to something that does pose us a serious threat. But it also shuts down our higher order information processing systems in our mind, and it reduces our rational thinking and points us towards that instinctive and instantaneous response, which in sort of past life conditions, when we were living in
literally
nature,
in survival, moment by moment, although arguably we still are, but yeah.
We are in many ways, but we don't often have nasty things jumping out from behind trees that we have to respond to quickly. Most of the time, even when serious threats arise these days in life, we usually have some time to consider them, as long as we don't get paralysed by fear. So when we come under the influence of fear, we often don't consider the longer term cause and effects of our actions or our potential actions, and also we lose sight of synchronicity. So that's a relatively higher order way of processing information.
So what do you mean by that? That's really interesting to me, but for many people maybe that's a bit hard to sort of grasp in the context of fear. What's that? Tease that out a bit.
Well, synchronicity is a term that was coined by Carl Jung, the famous psychologist, and it's really come from layer 6 and even sort of later stage layer 6 and perhaps early stage second tier thinking.
The notion that coincidence is more than coincidence.
Yeah, the notion that we live in an interconnected web and that we can draw messages from unlikely places, that might help us be guided to better decisions or to understand the meaning behind things that happen to us in life. And I think there's a famous story about Jung where he was dealing with a client and they were having this discussion about life in general and sort of fairly deeply philosophical issues. And I think if I remember rightly, there was a beetle or something that flew in the window and landed on the client, and there was meaning drawn from that. And for those people who really haven't explored this area in life and it hasn't been something that's come to them, it can sound very fluffy and sketchy and like it's sort of just new age fantasy. But once you do embrace it and start to look for these things, signs of synchronicity, then they are a lot more common than most people realise. And I could even link it from a scientific angle to the holographic theory of reality, where if we think about a holographic image, when we look at a holographic image from a scientific perspective, you can take any piece of that holograph and all of the information required to regenerate the entire picture is contained within any small piece of the hologram. And so we're extending that concept to life in general and embracing the concept that out of some small occurrence in life we can possibly unpack larger meaning and larger information, even to the point of quite concrete guidance around actions.
Which is related then to fractals, isn't it? Also that something great can be embedded in something very small and vice versa.
Yeah, that I guess patterns being self-similar at scale. Yeah, in that respect for sure. And from a simple sort of a Taoist perspective, what fear tends to do is it tends to sort of channel us into a quick action. So from a very sort of basic perspective, you could say that there's too much yang in terms of projecting, acting, and not enough yin energy, which is about opening, receiving the feminine, more relaxed aspect of remaining open to receive information.
And it's magical in that sense if you start to focus and experience periods of synchronicity and allow them to inform you in this way and just relax into them and make the meaning that is there for you. It doesn't have to be an extremely... it's a fine balance, I find personally, between making too much meaning out of something that is synchronous in your reality and making just that little piece of meaning that is valuable in that moment that it may be informing you with right there.
Yeah, and a couple of words you used there are quite insightful, because it's important to think about how we go about learning to work with synchronicity too. And often, usually for most people, it can be quite confusing when we're first stepping into that world, because we're looking for something we're not familiar with. We're trying to perceive, okay, am I really understanding this, or am I kind of fooling myself?
Yes.
And you mentioned the word magical, and for some people that means without basis. Whereas for other people it might mean awesome. And
mysterious, the numinous, the extraordinary, things that that inspire and allow our intuition to flourish and our creativity to flourish. In fact, that's how I see it.
Exactly, and there is a steep learning curve here when we step into this world of noticing synchronicity, being open to the possibility that there is something real there and that we can work with it. And in the process of learning how to do that, there is a lot of sort of experimentation and uncertainty around, okay, is this really here? Is that reasonable? Am I fantasizing? Those sorts of things. And we can only really answer those questions within ourselves by waiting to see what happens next, and then learning, okay, well, I thought that was that, but actually it didn't happen that way, so maybe I didn't interpret that correctly, and then refining our own process of observation, perceiving what might be there, and then how we actually apply that and integrate it into our
So you don't
life.
surrender the logical mind completely. You allow the other side of the brain to access this information, to feed you, to give you that, and then the logical mind will appraise that as time goes on in the way that you're talking about, perhaps.
Yeah, the logical mind needs to be there as a fallback. And if we think about the three fundamental zones of human development, we start out in the pre-rational zone, which is not rational, where we're responding to instincts, urges, very much in the moment, and very much also driven by emotions. And then we grow into the rational zone. And this is not to say that we're not rational in the pre-rational zone. We have access to rational processes there. It's just that they're not dominant. You know, when it comes to the crunch, emotions or instincts take over.
Take a teenager, for example.
Exactly. And then in the rational zone, the rational mind does become dominant. So we might feel the urges and instincts and emotions, but then the rational mind steps in and say, yes, but, you know, it's probably better to do this. And then when we're growing beyond that into the trans-rational, which is a place where synchronicity really does feature, and also deep intuition, and it's not rational, in that crossover between growing from rational to trans-rational, often we will mistake pre-rational things for trans-rational things, and that's part of the learning process. So we might get a feeling, and we're not sure if that feeling is actually our intuition or whether it's just a fear popping up. And again, it's only really through mindfulness and observation and waiting to see what happens next that we can learn how to discern between those things.
And of course, that will be always affected to one degree or another by an individual's psychology and how that's interplaying with the experience of life that you're having in the moment. And to tease that out, whether this is just a reaction, so to speak, from my psychology, or this is actually something that's independent from that has some other value and meaning to me in this moment.
Yeah, and what we're saying here is really only relevant to people who are transiting through layer 6 and in the process of making that transition to second tier consciousness. For people who are centered in other value systems like the sort of mainstream scientific, industrial, etc., it really is, it's something that will be relevant to them in the future, perhaps. Yeah. So
just a question on the trans-rational, because it's a word for many people that may not be easily understood. How does the logical brain situate within a trans-rational reality for somebody?
Well, it's important to remember that these things are nested inside each other. So the pre-rational has the rational layered over the top, and then the trans-rational gets layered over the top of that. So the other ones don't go away. We still have access to them all. And then it becomes a matter, once we're sort of capable of trans-rational operation, a matter of going with the flow and naturally allowing ourselves to shift between all of those different ways of perceiving and processing and using whatever's appropriate in the moment.
Yes, and that's the key, is using whatever's appropriate in the moment.
Yeah, and it's a very dynamic thing. It's not that we throw one away and adopt the next one. It doesn't work that way. It really is a nested arrangement, and ultimately, the research shows us that the most complex problems that humanity has to face are best addressed from the most sophisticated operating process, and that most sophisticated operating process, as far as we know, is that integration of trans-rational, rational and pre-rational, and using those at appropriate times.
Very good.
So just back to the fear thing to wind that up. All of those implications of operating under the control of fear mean that often if we have to respond to a very significant issue that has long-term impacts, the actions we take when we're driven by fear actually create further problems that only compound with the original one. And so, we are not doing ourselves a service when we're allowing fear to control us under those circumstances. And we can't sort of sit here in judgment and say, well, China should have done this or they should have done that, because we simply don't have enough information at the moment. What we can do, though, is we can look at things like the stock market response, which is often driven by fear, because that's the way stock markets work, and say, okay, well, we're actually, we're doing ourselves a disservice by reacting so emotionally to possibilities that haven't played out yet. And we would be better served at both an individual and a collective level if we could show some restraint and really go with confirmed facts and put ourselves in a situation where we can respond quickly if we need to, but not jump the gun, so to speak. And of course, the media plays an enormous role in this process. And as we said at the beginning of the show, imagine if they were reporting standard influenza statistics the way that they're reporting coronavirus statistics at the moment, it would sound way, way more scary. Yeah. Because of the higher rate of deaths and those sorts of things. So, a lot to think about there.
Although I suppose just to bring vaccines into this, there are always vaccines for the current flu season, so I guess people feel safer because there is a vaccine if you want to take a vaccine, but there is no vaccine so far for the coronavirus. So I guess that's a small element in that equation there.
It is true, yeah. But at the end of the day, for most of the world, the level of risk at this moment is very low.
Yeah. Yes, okay.
So I know you've got some potentially good developments that have come out of the coronavirus issue there. Do you want to take a short break and come back?
We'll take a short break and come back.
You're resonating right now on Future Sense with Steve McDonald and Nick Jeans.
You're tuned to Future Sense with Steve McDonald and Nick Jeans, and we've been talking about the coronavirus and fear and more and synchronicity. And thanks for your text, Dudley. Excellent explanation. He says, fear and synchronicity. Well said and very relevant to present times. Indeed. Thank you for that. Yes, we were talking a little bit about a website, exponentialview.co, which I do appreciate a lot of his reporting, and he looks at some of the ways that the coronavirus may change our world. Now, these are not necessarily positive things, but they are things that seem to be emerging as we go forward with this particular crisis on the planet. And we're going to go through some of these now. The first one is to reinforce the power of scientific collaboration and the open sourcing of global threats. And that's an interesting one. Chinese researchers sequenced the coronavirus days following the outbreak. This is pretty unusual. Preliminary genome data was available online, although they haven't yet shared physical samples of the virus. And I thought I'd just play a little bit of this here. This is actually the sequence spoken, because the sequence is it's a massive tiny bundle of protein, the troublesome 120 nanometer diameter spiky virus. In its shell is a wound-up pair of DNA strands carrying just 8 kilobytes of genetic code. That's not very much. And it sounds like this if it's read out. Just a little bit of this. And so on.
No wonder it's causing trouble, Nick.
Had to play a bit of that. It's kind of crazy. I don't know why somebody would go to such trouble to do it. But there you go. European countries started InfluenzaNet in 2003 to track flu symptoms as reported by individuals. Flu Near You started in the US in 2011. And Lauren Gardner, a civil engineering professor at Johns Hopkins and the co-director of the Center for Systems Science and Engineering, led the launch of a real-time map of the spread of the 2019 coronavirus. So what they're saying here, of course, is that the collaboration and the open sourcing is becoming better and better on the planet, and this is encouraging this as we go forward.
And that's a clear part of the trend in the values shift from the scientific industrial way, which is all about restricting information for your own power, to the layer 6 approach, which is very much network-centric and about sharing and open sourcing.
A group of online archivists have created an open access directory of 5,000 plus scientific studies about coronavirus that anyone can access for free. It's illegal, but it's also a moral imperative. That's good. Interesting contrast, a large number of critical Ebola research was inaccessible during the outbreak, and even today, downloading a single paper could cost $45, a steep price for a healthcare worker in Liberia, for example.
I think there's a bit of that going on around the world at the moment. It's illegal, but it's a moral imperative.
I love it. Well, and that's part of the breakdown of the restructuring of systems, isn't it?
Well, it is.
This is necessary. We actually have to go up against the regulations and the restrictions and face them down a little bit to make change.
It's normal during a transition like this,
Number 2 on this list is, and there's other points here, you can go to this article yourself if you like, in exponentialview.co. Digital quarantines through better information and social credit systems are also emerging. The Chinese authorities, again, of course, are using computerized systems that track IDs, and we talked about this, I think, last week or the week before, to round up people from Wuhan and separate them from others. Although across the country, the response from local authorities often resembles the mass mobilizations of the Mao era rather than the technocratic data-driven wizardry depicted in propaganda about China's emerging surveillance state. They've also turned to techniques Beijing used to fight the outbreak of SARS in 2002 and 2003, when China was much less technologically sophisticated. Yeah.
And I think we can draw from that there's been an awful lot of criticism of government surveillance, but I mean, this is one example where it's actually been helpful.
Yeah. And that's right. I mean, as we often say on this show, in regards to very many issues, it's very rarely black or white.
That's right.
And much more complex.
And it's usually not the technology or the particular process that's good or bad. It's what human values are applied to the deployment of it. Yeah.
One of their readers recently briefed them on social credit in China, and says that he thinks that the 2019 NCOV might catalyse discussions with the Chinese Communist Party about how digital IDs could be used to manage epidemics in the future. And again, it's a contestable point. I mean, how many people actually want to be ID'd in this way?
Yeah.
Even if it's going to enhance your safety with regard to these kind of outbreaks. Number 3 on this list, reinforce the importance of genomic technologies. And I referred to this already, but during the SARS outbreak, it took scientists about 5 months, I didn't know that, to sequence the virus. It was done by the US and Canadian scientists at that time, and it took the Chinese, as I said, just 1 month to sequence this virus. And of course, the cost of genomic sequencing has declined faster than Moore's law, which is, if you can look that up. So that's a big change. And it's also the case that frontline testing from swab samples is still rare and expensive. A real-time reverse transcription PCR test costs close to $100 and $10, making it a costly undertaking. We said before that we're informed, apparently, that it costs up to $3,000 for these sort of tests in the US. I would dispute that. We'd have to look that up.
But could be a profit margin in there, perhaps.
You think?
Maybe.
Number 4 on this is remote everything. And of course, we've been talking a lot about this during the show over the couple of years we've been here about the relocalization generally. But there's a couple of examples here. Tencent, a business, announced in China that they are pushing the date to return to offices until the end of February. That's already happened. But everyone will now work from home. Tsinghua University is starting on its original schedule, but online. But beyond work, we're seeing it with gyms, trainers live streaming classes you can join from home. I think we'll see a lot more playful use cases emerge, especially with the live streaming culture already established. Work from home is very much not part of the mainstream culture in China, but hoping that actually happens. And of course, it's happening very much in our developed countries more and more. And that idea that you don't have to travel to do what you do, generally speaking, is emerging quite strongly on the planet. And this seems to be stimulating that direction.
Definitely, it's certainly helpful that we have this technology right now when people are being confined to their homes. Otherwise, we'd probably see, what else would people do? Probably there'd be a population boom, perhaps.
That's going to go counter to some ideas about what's going on.
Exactly.
There's also things like a contactless food delivery where your takeaway is left at a designated area. KFC and Pizza Hut are offering the same service. China's largest classified site, 58.com, and real estate platform Anjuk offered limited-time virtual reality and live streaming services to allow buyers to select a house without ever visiting in person. That'd be hard, I think, wouldn't it? That'd be hard to ascertain without walking around a space and feeling the atmosphere. And
I think I'd wait till after the quarantine was over and go check the house out, to be honest.
Absolutely. And more relevant, I think, to the things that we'd like to talk about, number 5 on this list of potential global changes that are occurring via or accelerating via this virus, the encouragement into self-sufficiency, especially around food, energy and products. And we talked about supply chains earlier, but global supply chains are going to notice that Chinese factories are not filling them up. The vulnerability to this single point of failure will become increasingly apparent. Our globalized offshore manufacturing is looking like the anti-internet, interconnected yet dependent on a large super node rather than networked, decentralized and resilient. How's this going to work, though, with companies like Amazon, which is the biggest, it's about the biggest company in the world, and similar things? It's fascinating, really.
In terms of distribution.
Yeah.
Look, I think the main things around that relocalisation and supply chains relate to the possibility of producing things locally and not having to pay for the cost of, remote factories and supply chains through things like automation, robotics, 3D printing and those sorts of things. Yeah.
And as he continues here, vertical farming could allow some kind of food sustainability at a community or city level. And we're certainly seeing a lot of that in this region, which is fantastic.
And there's some great technology coming out too, like computerized farming devices where, it will plant use cameras to monitor plants, and the images are used to discern what fertiliser is required, how much water is required, all that sort of stuff. So there's some incredible technology coming out now.
And thus also local manufacturing along those same lines will be increasingly important. Given the specialist nature of products, there won't be an iPhone factory in every city. And as we're saying here, rather 3D printing is increasingly coming of age. I saw recently some houses that were literally printed out of hemp concrete. That was fantastic. That was fabulous.
Awesome.
Yeah. And lastly, number 6 here, which is a tricky one too. Coronavirus gives every reason to build digital walls to close borders, isolate particular groups, stigmatise certain behaviours, and fuel distrust against groups identified as other. There's a difficult area here.
It is, and it relates back to which value system is dominant, in terms of addressing the problems. And we might, if we get time before the end of this show, we might just quickly skip through the first 6 value systems in Graves' model and just talk about their problem-solving approaches in this kind of context.
And there's a lot more, and if you'd like to join the conversation, 0437341119, we have a couple of other texts. I'll come to those in a little while. But that's about it. So there's a number of things there, but particularly the relocalization is fascinating. And this is clearly a region here, and as we're talking about Graves' model, which is significantly moving into green, into layer 6, and we're seeing because of that this real focus on growing your own food, on looking after energy close to home, individually, possibly trading energy, trading food, trading other goods and services. A lot of some of the Facebook groups locally are really great in terms of giving and receiving items and recycling, thus things that one might need or not need anymore. So there's really a great movement here.
You're tuned to Future Sense with Nick Jeans and Steve McDonald. Engage, emerge, activate, and spiral up.
It's 10:43 here, coming to the end of today's Future Sense show, which you can listen to again if you missed it on the Bay FM website in full with music and everything else, or wait for our podcast, which will be up within 24 hours at futuresense.it or through your platforms.
We're going to just look through the first tier value systems now and look at their particular approaches to problem solving and how they might be applied in this kind of context where we've got a large scale, global scale issue to address, and lots of issues and obstacles standing in our way around how we do that. And just before that, I just wanted to mention that those of you who listen to us regularly will remember that over the last year, probably about a year and a half almost, we've been talking about an economic turning point, which was scheduled for January, the 18th of January actually, and it's part of an algorithm or computer-based model that belongs to Armstrong Economics, the brainchild of Martin Armstrong, that is put together over many, many years and through incredible historical research and observations of trends, particularly in financial markets, but also he's gone to the point of looking at how empires have risen and fallen and their relationship to trading and economic issues such as the issue of currency and all those sorts of things. And over time, he noticed that the computer algorithm that he put together also coordinated with things like solar cycles, which of course impact weather on the planet and impact human activity. And so we've had, although nothing too specific, but we've had a message coming from his predictive system for quite some time, a couple of years. He's been talking about this particular turning point, which has potentially given us a heads up that there was going to be some kind of economic hard landing at this time this year. So I guess I would commend his work. It's not perfect, like any kind of system. It has its sort of potential use and also some potential downfalls. But
there's so many variables in this kind of thing, isn't there?
Yeah, but certainly it's been useful for us to know that there was going to be some kind of economic hiccup at this time, and we didn't know how it was going to play out. We certainly didn't know that it was going to be to some extent driven by the outbreak of this coronavirus, but it was predictable that there was going to be some kind of issue around now. Let's talk about value systems which give rise to worldviews, which of course That term worldview is used to explain how people make sense of the world, how they see the world, and whether they see the world as something to be taken advantage of, or some big scary thing, or some wonderful magical place. Really comes back down to their value systems, which relate at a deeper level to the layer of consciousness which is dominant. And helps them make sense of reality. So I'm going to go through initially the first tier, and then we'll talk briefly about second tier just to finish the show. At layer 1 in Graves' system, which is basic hunter-gatherer survival type behaviour, we respond to problems with reference to immediate survival implications. So we tend to act in the moment fairly quickly, but we also can develop practices over time to help us stay safe, and I guess you might call them good habits. And the focus at layer 1 is relatively short-term and on an individual level. And then each of these systems, of course, leans either towards individual considerations or communal considerations. And so the next system, layer 2, is all about communal approaches. And being a communal system, it's all about conforming in some way and working together with people in conformity. So at that layer, we can expect us to be addressing problems with reference to ways of protecting us all, and particularly at small scale like family or tribe scale, and then perpetuating those practices, those ways of conforming that help us out through storytelling. And the stories tend to be like parables, and we see this, of course, in indigenous practices where we've got these stories, in some cases, which have been told for tens of thousands of years, telling the same stories over and over again in order to benefit our tribe and to perpetuate our way of living.
Yes.
And then layer 3 leans back towards the individual focus again. It tends to be very self-serving and short-term in its thinking, layer 3, and very much power-driven. So it sees everything as some kind of power struggle or the need to express power, is the primary way, active way of addressing problems. So often there'll be a very quick response. It'll be a very high energy response, and often without a lot of consideration of long-term implications. But sometimes that can be really useful to act fast, act quickly, and be very, very proactive. Layer 4 leans back towards the communal side of things again. So it's conformity based, and at layer 4 we're talking about the authoritarian way of living, which was prominent during the agricultural era and is still around, remembering that all of these things, they don't disappear, they simply move from being dominant to being less dominant, but usually it's still present within society. So in a layer 4 problem-solving approach, people who operate through this value system are generally very willing to sacrifice their personal needs in order to comply with whatever a higher authority is asking, and also to serve the greater good. So that's really the ultimate sort of purpose that's put forward under that layer 4 system. And we can really see how this is played out in the Chinese response, where people have been so willing to do what they're told for the greater good, and to obey the government there and stay home and isolate themselves and those sorts of things.
Because you have to wonder just on the Chinese, and we've talked about this I think before too, that there's probably a lot of the population who are not as happy to surrender to that, because they are also emerging themselves into a different paradigm.
Of course. In every society, there's no society that is
just one thing,
necessarily just one value system. Usually you get a mixture of value systems, and that's part of that process is that human development requires us to grow through value systems. So there are always people who are still growing up to whatever the dominant system might be, driven by the complexity of life conditions, of course, and are always some people who kind of poke ahead of the mainstream and are moving into different value systems as a minority of the society. So in layer 4, things are always reduced to a black and white, yes or no choice. So it's either do the right thing, don't do the wrong thing. Usually that's how it plays out. And it's being a communal system, it thinks long term, so it's very mindful of long-term implications. Layer 5, which is the dominant value system across much of Western society, so we're talking about the modern mindset here, the scientific industrial approach to life, tends to be very strategic. So it'll consider all of the things that we've discussed so far from the other value systems, but it's not just looking to protect itself or its interests, it's also looking to take advantage of the situation. It always looks for some way of exploiting the situation. How can we not only deal with this, but actually make money out of it or benefit ourselves somehow? I'm reminded of one of the comments that we mentioned on an earlier show about the US politician who came out and said, well, this is great for US trade, that China's trade's been shut down. But probably not too much long-term thinking here. And this, again, being an individually oriented system, it tends to think relatively short-term. I mean, it's not as short-term as layer 3, but if you look in the corporate world, it's rare to find a business plan that looks out further than sort of 3 to 5 years maximum. And often people are just thinking about the short-term wins rather than the longer-term game under this value system. And just to give an example of not only solving or keeping oneself safe, but also benefiting from the way that we act in a strategic way, I just want to tell a really quick little story here about this is based on a true story, and it was a story that was often told when I was in the military, and it's about a soldier who's a candidate for selection to a special forces unit, and he's going through the selection process, and in the selection process, of course, they pose all sorts of problems for people to solve, and they watch how people deal with the problems, and that's part of how they select the candidates for special forces. And so this guy was chained to a railway line, and it was a pretty short chain, so he was fairly close to the track, and they'd set this up on a piece of track, a real piece of railway track, where there was a switch or a mechanism to divert the train onto a nearby track very close to where this guy was, but he was blindfolded, of course, and so he couldn't see what was happening. All he knew was, probably from noise and feeling what was going on, he could feel the railway track, he could obviously feel that he was chained and the chain was connected to the railway track, and then they had a carriage which they moved along the railway track nearby, and so he could hear the noise of the train approaching and probably the vibration through the track and the ground of this big thing rumbling down the track, and of course not knowing that there was a diversion nearby, and so thinking that, okay, this is probably going to perhaps come very close to me and maybe injure me, so he's got to think about his personal protection. But then if he's capable of layer 5 or higher operation, he'll also think about how he can take advantage of the situation. And in this true story, what this person did was he got the chain that he was attached to the track by, and he just draped it over one of the railway tracks so that as the train came past, it would cut the chain and release him from that situation. So that's a really good example of how layer 5 thinks, not just to solve a problem, but also how can we take advantage of this as well. And then layer 6.
Then he sold 2 pieces of chain on eBay after that. Told his story.
I think it would be a collector's item, actually. Yeah, right. You could probably sell it for benefit. That would be another layer 5 approach. Layer 6, some of the trends that we know we're seeing, and of course are sort of coded into the way layer 6 operates, are starting to appear in the response and the thinking around coronavirus. And some of these trends are, as we've heard today, relocalization. And the relocalization, one of the key drivers of that is, of course, just the natural way that people who are operating through layer 6 are drawn to human bonding, and they want to be close to their immediate network. They want to know who they're dealing with. They want to know that they have trusted sources for supply and those sorts of things. And also, part of the driver there is when you know those things, you can have a more resilient community, when you're not relying on somebody that you don't know, that you perhaps don't know whether you can trust to be sending you supplies from a long distance. And so localization is a definite trend, and we're seeing that play out now, and that's to be expected. Trusted known networks. Also a return to nature and natural ways of doing things. Yeah. And I guess we are seeing that in terms of people considering natural remedies and treatments, potentially ways of looking after themselves in the face of a virus threat. And also there's been a lot of talk and consideration about the circumstances, at least one of the most likely and most accepted scenario for the rise of this viral outbreak was a wet market where
strange animals are all there for food in very unhealthy environments,
unhealthy conditions. And of course, from a layer 6 perspective, that would be unacceptable ethically, for many reasons. So again, a layer 6 approach would be to deal with that and the circumstances around the probable outbreak of the virus itself and the spread of it. And also Layer 6 thinks about security and in all of the various applications of that term, not just sort of physical security, but security of sort of health and security of supply and all those sorts of things, and also the minimisation of corruption and undesirable human impacts. And so things that are arising from those motivators are the automation of technological systems, and I'm thinking particularly of things like blockchain, which have been designed not only to make better and more responsive systems, but also to cut out the risk of human corruption.
Yes, they have. And just quickly on a text referring to some of this too from Dudley, if science and technology is created with an ethical foundation, this world would overcome the danger of its misuse, etc. So that's what's happening here.
Exactly. So that's a strong Layer 6 trend. And another example of that is the use of automation in industry, where we are taking people away from having to act like robots in jobs and replacing them with actual robots, for example. And finally, just to wind up, a very quick look at how Layer 7 from second tier would approach the problem-solving issue in this context. And one of the characteristics of Layer 7's problem-solving is advanced pattern recognition. And we're talking now about particularly complex combinations of patterns, where Layer 7 is able to scan large scale, look at multiple systems operating and see patterns in the interaction and overlap of those systems, and then look for possibilities of leverage by impacting just one small thing, which would impact a whole array of systems that are influencing each other. Also considering multi-dimensional information gathering from sources that wouldn't be considered by first-tier mindsets, and then the tailoring of solutions to appeal to particular value systems of particular groups of people in particular places. So no blanket solutions, but tailored, very, very carefully considered tailored solutions that take into account the motivations of people according to which value system they live by.
Very good. I have to leave it there. Thanks for the last text. A couple we can't get to. Pathological selfishness due to hyper-individualism seems to be the evolutionary sticking point for us now. We need to cultivate community consciousness that sincerely seeks resolution and solutions as never before. Like that? That's very good. Thank you. And we'll be with you. Well, you won't be here. You're away for a month.
Actually, this is my last time in the studio for the next month or so. So I'm travelling to the US and then Europe, and I'll do my best to do some remote reporting while I'm away.
We'll be doing it. Thanks for joining us.
You've been listening to Future Sense, a podcast edited from the radio show of the same name, broadcast on Bay FM in Byron Bay, Australia, at bayfm.org. Future Sense is available on iTunes and SoundCloud. The future is here now. It's just not evenly distributed.